Hi, Dr. P here with the first try to categorize wargames by function. Now, what do I mean? I'm interested in how the game plays, not in what it looks like. So function, not form. I want to know what the players have to think about and what kinds of things they do. After all, that's what a game is all about. So it isn't important whether it's a block game or a hex and counter game, whether it's for one player or two players or partners or multi-sided, even whether it's a card game or a board game or a video game. What's important is what the player has to think about, what kinds of problems the player must solve, what kinds of solutions the player must use. I am not interested in puzzles. I'm only interested in games. Puzzles have always correct solutions. Most one-player games are actually puzzles, especially if computer programming isn't involved, as in tabletop games. Computer programming can provide more unpredictability, and that's often called a one-and-a-half-player game. Parallel competitions, such as the common Euro-style games and many Olympic games, are puzzles, albeit they may have more than one always correct solution. But they still have solutions built into the game. Also, history is not inevitable, and many war games, quote unquote, force players to play in a way that reproduces history if they want to win. These are also puzzles by and large. I'm interested in games that show that what happened in history is only one of many possible occurrences and often not the most likely occurrence. So I'm interested in open games, not closed games, is another way to put this. So here is my list. We have maneuver dominant, combat dominant, hidden info dominant, economy dominant, command and control, negotiation alliance, and perhaps history dominant. And I'll go through each one of these. Combinations are common, of course. Many games won't be dominated by any one function. And when you come down to it, many games are combinations. All are, to some extent. I'm not sure you could make a game that was purely one of these elements. But in some games, one or two functions dominate. And if we identify the dominating possibilities, which I'm trying to do, we can see how they work in combination games. So, maneuver dominant is the first one I listed. And I listed those in no particular order. So I'm not trying to imply that maneuver dominant is the best or that maneuver dominant is the most common. It's certainly not the most common. So I'm going to start with a quotation from Sir Winston Churchill. And I'm sure other people said it before Churchill, and many other people have said it since. Quote, "Battles are won by slaughter and maneuver. The greater the general, the more he contributes in maneuver, the less he demands in slaughter." Unquote. So, in game terms, we're talking about situations where the side with weaker forces still has a decent chance to win by outmaneuvering the enemy. Combat is definitely secondary. Now, if you think about chess and checkers and Go, classic games of that sort, they are heavily maneuver dominant because the combat is predetermined and often just amounts to something like chess, where you move into a square and take whatever piece is there. In general, maneuver dominant games are much easier to do with hidden movement or fog of war, so that makes the classic games look even better. And I have to say, those classic games are all puzzles, but they're too difficult for humans to solve, so we can treat them like games. Then we have combat dominance, which I suspect is the most common kind of war game. Games where maneuver is secondary and combat is dominant. Very often the stronger side in combat terms, or the luckier in combat terms, will win the game. So we're talking as dominant as more important, and also often as more time consuming. Think of Axis and Allies. It's a dice fest of combat. Yes, there is maneuvering, but not much, and also in particular, everything is visible. There's no hidden information. But the defender cannot even retreat, which is extremely anti-maneuver. The defender cannot even retreat. So how much can maneuver influence what's going on? Now, most miniatures war games are combat dominant because you got all these miniatures on the table. People can generally see everything that's there, and what's important is how well you fight. Many role-playing games are combat dominant, but there's much flexibility there. If you think of an old style of playing Dungeons and Dragons, for example, it was, let's go to the next room, fight whatever's there. Let's go to the next room, fight whatever's there, and so on. It was mostly about combat. Now, a good Dungeons and Dragons game is more than that, but that was often the way people played. Now, if you consider the two great strategic doctrines or methods of warfare, the direct and the indirect, direct is associated with combat dominance, and indirect is associated with maneuver dominance. If you're using the indirect methods, you don't want to fight. And if you do fight, you want it to be a massacre because you arrange things so that it is a massacre. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to fight. I've discussed this elsewhere in far more detail. But as I was making this, it occurred to me that there is this association. Then we have hidden information dominant, and of course the fog of war is part and parcel of that. And this is typically arranged in tabletop games through blocks or pieces with stands, so that in either case a player can see his own pieces, but the enemy only knows that there's a piece there and does not know its identity and strength. Now, these games may tend to emphasize either maneuver or combat. By nature, they lean to maneuver because you don't know exactly what's there. But Columbia Games block style, and Columbia Games publishes many, many block games, is much more combat oriented. Many maneuver games are also hidden information games. They tend to go together. And of course, the computer games often have a fog of war, which lends itself to maneuver games perhaps more than combat games. You can also think about surprise. Surprise is much more likely when a lot of hidden information is hidden. Then we have economy dominant. Then we have to say all long wars are economic wars. The question is, does economy dominate the game? This is often true of computer games, and in the extreme, the game becomes a resource management exercise, not a war game. Whoever manages resources best wins, as in Civilization, Hearts of Iron, Stars, and many others. Generalship hardly matters. But economy can be vital while still meshing with other aspects of the game. It doesn't have to completely take over the game. Command and control. This is often quite chaotic, like real warfare, and is another form of fog of war. Not so much that things are hidden as things don't work the way you want them to work. So, command and control reflects the tendency for orders to be misunderstood or poorly phrased, not carried out correctly, lost in transit. Think about the charge of the Light Brigade, where the orders were poorly phrased and the Light Brigade did exactly what the commander didn't want it to do. Chit pull activation is a random way to model this in tabletop games. Now, this is easier to implement in computer games, of course, because you can have the computer sort of randomly determine what orders are not carried out or what orders don't arrive. There's also problems with knowing the location and the strength and capability of enemy units and also of friendly units. Until your friendly unit has been involved in a fight, you don't know how good it's going to do, how well it's going to do. This reflects the real world, but many gamers don't actually want this. They want to feel in control. They want to feel that what happens comes from what they do player agency, in other words. And yet real warfare, there's a lot less what amounts to player agency and a lot more chaos and chance. Then we have negotiation or alliance dominant. These games have more than two sides. Now, there are many games with more than two sides that are not dominated by alliances and negotiation, especially parallel competitions. Your typical non-war game today is a parallel competition. Players are all doing their own thing. But in games where players can help or hinder one another, you tend to have negotiation and possibly alliances. Being able to help or hinder one another leads to cooperation because each player is outnumbered at least 2-1, if not much more. If it's a 7-player game, they're outnumbered 6-1. So cooperation requires negotiation and possibly alliances. And again, diplomacy is the obvious epitome. Diplomacy has a reputation for being cutthroat and backstabbing, but that's because a lot of people play it short term rather than long term. Long term, that's not the best way to play. But diplomacy is one of the most cooperative games in the world because you can't win it on your own. What are some common combinations? Well, we have maneuver and hidden information that go hand in hand. Where the maneuvers can be hidden, they're more likely to be effective. Negotiation alliance games usually involve longer time scales, and they're often combined with economy. Nation versus nation is usually war, not just a single battle. Command and control often seems paired with combat dominance, and perhaps it's more common in battle games. The command and control problems work themselves out or become more manifest in actual combat. Now we have the category that I have great doubts about, which I've called history dominant for lack of another name. It came to mind when I was thinking about my game Britannia. It is far from history is inevitable in play, but it does illustrate 1,000 years of history. It is multiplayer, but it's not a game with alliances and without a lot of negotiation. So what is it? And what are other sweep of history games that frequently use the Britannia system? I don't know. Now, you want to think about these functions when you design conflict games, whether they're historical or otherwise. You need to think about what really matters. Now, this has been a first try. I welcome comments about other functions, and there will be a screencast about wargame forms as opposed to functions. Thanks for listening.